Do you have a 1996 to 2004 Ford Crown Victoria, Mercury Grand Marquis, or Lincoln Town Car, and you're looking for just a little bit more power? You don't have a lot of money? You come to the right place. So, the very first modification I could recommend to any 1996 to 2004 Panther owner is to make sure your throttle cable is as tight as it should be. That recommendation would actually go to pretty much any car that has a throttle cable. So, over the years, like many things, the throttle cable tends to wear out. It gets a little bit loose, and it's not as taut as it should be. What does that do? Well, having a loose throttle cable will actually lessen the amount of air that goes into your engine because it simply won't let your throttle body open as much as it should. It'll open up about 3/4 of the way and sometimes even halfway. And the problem with that is less air can get through the throttle. So even when you floor it, you're not getting all the air that you should get. So, how do we solve that? Zip ties. Zip ties are great because they're very cheap and you can get them pretty much anywhere. So what you're going to want to do is crawl underneath your dashboard, locate your accelerator pedal. Once you find your pedal, you're going to want to find the lever that it's attached to. That lever is going to be attached to the throttle cable. What you want to do is pull your accelerator pedal up to where the lever is against the firewall. You're going to want to pull that cable as tight as you can get it without actually pulling on the throttle on the engine. Once you do that, you're going to go ahead and stick some zip ties between the space. Mine took about 3. One added benefit to bringing up your accelerator pedal is now your accelerator pedal and your brake pedal are closer together. That's actually going to lessen the amount of time that you spend between braking and accelerating, or vice versa. So that's actually going to help you perform better as a driver. My number 2 recommendation, make sure your airflow is as seamless as possible. So, from the factory, a 96 to 2004 Panther has an airbox that looks something like this. Some of them actually have a snorkel that goes in here that actually lessens the amount of air that can get in there to about maybe an inch and a quarter. So, if your model actually has that snorkel, go ahead and rip that thing out of there. It'll help you immensely. But for those of you who want a little bit more, I got something for you. Get out your favorite cutting tool or utensil that you prefer to use when cutting on plastic and go ahead and open up that front half of that box there. A high flow filter is definitely a plus. Number 3, later model Panther zip tube. So from the factory, Ford put this very awkward 3-bend zip tube on their Panthers. Not only does it have 3 bends, making it terribly restrictive, the first bend actually comes straight out from the throttle and hits a wall. The next bend is almost a 90. The later models had 1 bend. It's not even a 90. So what does that do? Well, less bends equal less restriction equals more airflow equals more power. Simple. Which brings us to number 4. Number 4 is a 5.4 2-valve throttle body. Long story short, a 5.4 throttle body has a slightly larger throttle blade. And a slightly larger throttle blade equals more air. More air, more power. And my number 5 recommendation, a ported plenum. Porting out the plenum will actually help that engine bring in some much needed CFM. Now, I will admit, this may actually be the most complicated, advanced, and expensive modification on my list, but I promise you, it is the most worthwhile. The reason it might be considered complicated is simple. It is very easy to destroy one of these plenums by doing the port job incorrectly. That being said, however, it is very easy to port one of these things out. You basically just want to deburr it and make it as seamless as possible inside there. Get rid of the casting flash and all the cast seams and everything that will cause the air to be turbulent. And when you get to the end where you are going to connect the plenum to the intake manifold there, all you really want to do is use the old gasket as a template and cut that. I say don't do that until the end because you don't want to find out that you actually cut too much of the plenum and it's not going to seal properly. A cheap but effective tool I can recommend is a Chicago electric die grinder. You can grab those at Harbor Freight, as well as some sanding rolls. You can also get those from Harbor Freight. A great tool I could recommend to go with those would be these carbide bits. Just be really careful when using these because these will chew up aluminum pretty quickly. Same with these, but not as easily. Go slow at first, only take a little bit at a time. You'll be surprised how much that little bit really helps. I do recommend that you take your time and you move slow. You make calculated decisions with what you're doing and you always pay attention. You can mess these up very easily. Now, if you're still watching this video, you're probably wondering to yourself, how much is all this going to cost me? The great news is, not much. Let's go step by step. The very first modification was tightening the throttle cable. That required some zip ties. Zip ties, if you do not already have them, can be bought at the dollar store for $1.25. Then you got the labor of crawling underneath the dashboard and doing all that. So not much. The next modification I showed you was cutting of the airbox. Cutting of the airbox requires you to have certain tools. And if you do not already have those tools, well, obviously it's the price of the tools plus the labor to do the job. No big deal. The next modification I showed you was the later model zip tube. The later model zip tube can vary in your area. I'd say anywhere from 20 bucks to about 100 bucks. Anything more than that, I wouldn't do it. But, you know, I'm not in your area, so I can't recommend. And I can't really give a fair estimate. You have to actually modify it for certain years so you can run certain breathers needed for, you know, I got one for the IAG motor over there and one for the valve cover. But however you guys want to do it, that's up to your discretion. The next modification after that was the throttle body. Now, I got my throttle body from the same salvage yard that I got the zip tube from. It cost me the same 30 bucks, and that was right out the door. You might be able to get it cheaper out of you pull it, though. I don't know. The last modification that I showed you guys was the porting of the intake plenum. Porting of the intake plenum requires a Dremel tool, a drill, or, you know, the die grinder that I showed you. I recommend using a voltage regulator if you do use that die grinder. But, you know, that's up to your discretion and how you guys actually want to tackle that job. It's not a hard job. It's not an easy job, but it's not a complicated job. It's not too bad. It just takes some time and some know-how. So that, you know, you might have to pay somebody to do it. And if you do, I really wouldn't recommend it as a cheap modification because, I mean, now you're spending money on it. But, you know, it's up to you. It's whether you want to do it or not. My channel is more for a do-it-yourself thing, but that's up to you. So that is my top 5 first modifications you should do to your 96 to 2004 Panther. Some of these modifications could actually be used on other vehicles as well as older Panthers, and some can actually be used on newer Panthers. But it depends, you know, I could make a whole video on the differences between years and makes and models and all that stuff, and it would just get really confusing. So we'll just chalk it up to know your platform, know what's going to work for you, and go ahead and do it. I thank anybody who watched this video, and I appreciate the time that you spent with me. Have a great day.